Welcome back, Metas. The new scenario for Once Human is here, and it comes with a bunch of new weapons and new armor pieces. One of those new weapons is Silent Anabasis. Now, this caught my attention because it's a Frost Vortex weapon, and when you create Frost Vortexes and shoot those Vortexes, it creates Ice Crystals, which is a cool new mechanic, and when you shoot those Ice Crystals, it does 300% Psi intensity. So what that looks like, let's see if we can do it. There's a crystal, and you shoot that, and does a bit of an explosion based on your Psi intensity. So it caught my interest for that reason, because I was like, oh, these crystals look pretty fun. And the other reason it caught my interest is it's not really tied to crit rate or crit damage or weak spot damage or anything else. So if you have a look at something like Icy Rain, it's quite heavily tied to crit rate because you need crit rate to trigger Frost Vortexes. Whereas this new weapon, you have a flat 10% chance to trigger Frost Vortex. So what it means is you're actually quite open to building in any direction. Do you go down crit rate and crit damage? Do you do weak spot? Or do you put all your, stat points into, elemental damage to bump up these crystal explosions? And that's pretty much what I wanted to work out. If you're not familiar with this channel, I work out the damage formulas and then pump them into an Excel spreadsheet. And so I push through a crit damage build, a weak spot damage build, and then an elemental build. And this is all kind of like end game builds with end game stats to see what performs best in what scenario. And we do have three pretty much distinct builds, which is probably the advantage of this weapon is you can go crit rate, you can go weak spot, and you can go elemental damage. And they perform better in different scenarios. And so I'm going to show you how to do that today. Okay, before we go over the different builds and the results, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with how the weapon functions. This is important because there's actually some massive issues with this description. I'm assuming they're translation issues, but it sounds much better than what it is. So we'll go through and I'll tell you which things are correct and which things are not correct. The first line, 10% chance to trigger a Frost Vortex on hit. So this is just hitting a target, a 10% chance you proc a Frost Vortex. This seems to be correct. So that's the Frost Vortex procking there. And a Frost Vortex will stay around for 4 seconds and it will do 4 damage, like 4 damages of tick. Now, you can only have 2 Frost Vortexes at once. So if you proc more than 2, one of them will be replaced and then it starts to tick damage again. So with other builds, what happens is you actually miss out on the tick damage because you just keep replacing the Frost Vortexes. This is part of the math that is really hard to predict because you don't know when you're going to get that Frost Vortex procking and when you might get some tick damage and when you might not get some tick damage. So I've had to just do my best to sort of adjust for that in some of the calculations. Then we have hitting a target with Frost Vortex generates an Ice Crystal. So once we've got Frost Vortex on that, so we have a 10% chance to spawn a Frost Vortex. And then when we hit that target with Frost Vortex on it, will spawn a crystal, but there is a 1.5 second cooldown on the crystal. So with this weapon, if you have extended magazine on it, the time to empty the magazine will only get you 3 crystals, even though technically you can spawn 4 Frost Vortexes. So let's say I've got 44 bullets in the magazine, 10% of 44 is 4.4. I should round that down, I should get 4 Frost Vortexes, hence I should get 4 crystals. However, there's a 1.5 second cooldown on the crystals, and I think the magazine empties in, where's my spreadsheet? Let me just open this up. Magazine empties in 3.5 seconds. So there's only time for actually 3 crystals. So when you do this, 1 crystal, 2 crystal, and in that case, I didn't get a 3rd crystal. But if everything does it well, we should get 3 crystals, right? 1, 2, 3 crystals, right? That's the max you're going to spawn with this magazine capacity is 3 crystals. And what I would be doing is not, as soon as they spawn, I'll be shooting them and then shooting again and then shooting them, then shooting again. There's my 3rd crystal. Cool. So that is all fine too. Shooting them will give you 300% Psi intensity. If you let them just blow up, you only get 100% Psi intensity. This is your Psi intensity here. Mine's very low because I'm not wearing any equipment right now. And it also counts as Frost Elemental status damage, and it does scale with Frost Vortex damage. However, there is a exception to that, and that is the Frost stuff on your mask does not count. This is in its own sort of damage stacking category. So for example, Obliteration says it increases Frost Vortex's final damage. This does not stack with crystals. And the other Frost in here also does not stack with the crystals. It stacks with your Frost Vortex, but doesn't stack with your crystals. So I'm not too sure if that's a mistake or intentional, but the ones on your mask, just remember the mask ones don't actually stack with the crystals. The other weapon damage, Frost Vortex and damage bonuses, they all stack with the crystals fine. Now, this is the last one that is completely and utterly balked. It says increases Frost Elemental damage by 60%. So this is just straight up incorrect off the bat. If you have a look at your Frost Vortex, Frost Elemental damage, 20%. So I've got no gear on, I've got no weapon mods on. This is just a base buff of 20% to your Frost Elemental damage. So it's not 60%. And the next line is incorrect too. It says increases it by an additional 20% for every ice crystal shattered for 10 seconds, stacking up to 15 times. It sounds like you get 20% elemental damage, 15 stacks of that, which is huge, every time you shatter a crystal. That is incorrect. What actually happens is you get 10% for shattering a crystal, and it stacks 3 times. We can see this here. If you look at the bottom, you'll see I'll start getting a buff as I stack these up, and it will max out at 3. Okay, so I've got 3. Inventory. Here it is. Frost bonus, Frost Elemental damage. It doesn't tell you the damage here because I think this is why it's bugged. But you can keep reprocking it. So you can keep it at 3. And when it's at 3, it'll give you a total of 30%. And every stack gives you 10%. So yeah, you'll max out at 30% when you do these. Cool. So open this up. So Frost Elemental damage, 50%. So you get a 50% total bonus. 20% is the flat rate. And then destroying crystals will give you 10% each, up to 3 stacks. Right. That's everything with the weapon itself. Now let's get into the builds. Okay, let me show you the results, and then you can pick which build you want to do. Just note that with all these calculations, I've actually took like an end game build. So like every armor slot had a maxed out mod. So for example, if I was doing crit damage, I had the full lone wolf set on, lone wolf gloves, and then whatever mod I was using was a violent mod, maxed 15% crit damage on those things. And the same thing applied to like a weak spot build. So I had all my weak spot mods maxed out, and then same for elemental damage. I also included Cradle Override options as well that were applicable, and also food buffs. So I tried to give the best representation of like an end game build with the max amount of stats per category, and this is what came out. Another thing to note is I obviously did different combinations too. So like for example, a crit build using the crossbow, a crit build with crossbow with Fateful Strike. So this is gonna favor body shots. Crit build with no crossbow, crit build with no crossbow, no mark target, light cannon. You don't have to worry about that now. I've just taken like the cream of the crop to give you like a summary of the results. So scenario 1 is a boss with a weak spot. It has an easy to hit weak spot, and the top performer was my weak spot build. So if you want to have a weak spot build, just skip forward to that. I'm going to tell you exactly what that was. But if you use my weak spot build versus my crit build with a crossbow, you're going to do 20, almost 30% more damage. And if you use my weak spot build against my elemental build with light cannon, you're going to do 25% more damage. So boss with a weak spot, you're going to want to choose my weak spot build. Right, a boss with no weak spot. The top performer was my crit build with Fateful Strike. And if you use that over my elemental build with light cannon, you're going to do 5% more damage. So this elemental build was actually pretty competitive. If you're looking for an elemental build with a boss with no weak spot, have a look at my elemental build with light cannon. And then of course, because there's no weak spot, it absolutely destroys my weak spot build. If you use my crit build with Fateful Strike, you're going to get like 52% more damage than my weak spot build. Okay, so bosses with no weak spot, you can either choose my crit build with Fateful Strike, or you can choose my elemental build with light cannon. Cool. Now on to add clear, and this is when there's 4 or more enemies around, because there are some specific mods that benefit Frost Vortex for this. And the top performer was my elemental build with obliteration. If you use the weak spot build to do add clear, you're going to do more damage, if you shoot the small enemies in the face. The thing is, with using the weak spot build on small add clear, is they die so quickly, sometimes you don't get the vortex proccing or your crystals proccing. So I actually prefer just to do my elemental build. So my recommendations are this, and you can now look at the builds. If you've got a boss with a easy to hit weak spot, go my weak spot builds. If you've got boss with no weak spot, go my crit build with Fateful Strike. And if you're doing add clear in solos, go my elemental build with obliteration. Let me talk you through them. Okay, starting with a general overview of the weak spot build, you can pause the video or take a screenshot and use this for later, and then I'll get to the mods in a second with the same setup, so you can just screenshot it or save the video. Right, starting with calibrations, all the calculations use a double weak spot for weak spot builds. Now, I didn't actually put in different calibrations and test all the calibrations again for this weapon. Previous testing showed that precision style is incredibly good. So if you want some general advice, I think this is a very solid calibration, but just know I haven't actually tested all the calibrations yet. I'm going to do that a bit later. The attacks plus 25% stat is just an incredibly good stat. It's like a flat increase to your damage, 25%. Range is not bad. And the fire rate, I don't think hinders this build too much, because you actually have a little bit of like built-in, I guess, cooldown with this weapon, because you can only make a crystal every 1.5 seconds. So having the gun shoot a little bit slower, you have to get off target anyway to shoot the crystals, I don't think is actually a bad thing. And the plus 25% attack is very good. So without doing the calculations, I'm definitely looking for a precision style until something else comes up. With the attributes, like I said previously, I just had, for the calculations, all my attributes maxed at weak spot damage. That's your precision suffix. The set bonus, we use the Renegade Hood. I would definitely aim for at least 3 in your set bonus for the Renegade Hood. The fourth one is actually really nice too, because you get a whack of magazine capacity added to the weapon based on your weak spot hits in the previous mag. So quite nice, because having the extra bullets in the magazine helps with shooting the crystals. For your unique item, I used the Covert Walker shirt. Now, it is called Covert Walker shirt once you've got it equipped, but if you're looking for the blueprint, it's actually called the Stealth Walker wrap. I'm not too sure why. It's just like a translation issue. I think the thing to remember with this build is you're not going to be top DPS. You're also not going to be bottom DPS. You're like an all-rounder build. You want a little bit of ad control. You want boss DPS. You kind of like in the center. So I would put on what you find best as like your utility here. Personally, I think the Covert Walker shirt is just incredibly good. It creates a vortex and sucks enemies into that vortex. That clusters all the enemies together. You then shoot your crystal, you get an explosion, you take them all out. It's very, very good for just controlling enemies during boss DPS phases, or it's really good actually in the raid, is what I used to get through the hard raid last season. So that's my recommendation. But if there's no small enemies to control and you're just looking at pure boss DPS, you can swap in this snow camo gloves. This is a new armor that came with Way of Winter. When you shatter a crystal, you get 4 additional ice missiles. They do 40% psi intensity as status damage. I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive on these at a later date, so stay tuned to the channel. I'll do some more armor combos for an elemental build. And then what I call your flexi slot, because you've still got 1 slot left. If you want to go for damage, you can put on your Bastille. Or if you're struggling with temperature, there are some other items right now that help with the temperature modifications, like it gives you cold and heat resistance on the very first slot, so you can put those in too, but it's up to you. That's a general overview. Now let's get to the weapon mods. Okay, so here are the mods for the Weakspot build. You can screenshot this or save the video for later. Starting with the weapon mods, remember that there's some utility in this build. It's not all about damage. I think Frosty Blessing is one of the best weapon mods for a Vortex build because you get 10% of your HP back. It's incredibly good during the beginning of a scenario because you don't have to craft any heals. You just get your health back from spawning Frost Vortexes. Obviously not as good as the Icy Rain SMG, which spawns a lot of Frost Vortexes, but you will notice you'll get some of that HP back and you can stay in the game a little bit longer and don't have to keep crafting heals. If you want to go for full damage, then you can use the Cryo Blast. It's going to give you vulnerability plus 4%. Damage calculation is really easy on this because vulnerability applies to bullets and it applies to elements and it applies to Frost Vortexes and it applies to crystals. So essentially, it is a 4% buff on your damage. I don't know. Personally, for me, I prefer to take the health over a 4% buff. I do think this is better for PvP, but I don't play on PvP servers because you do get a movement speed negative 10%. So I think that's probably pretty good for PvP, but not sure. Right. Helmet, we go with Precise Strike, which is give you extra weak spot damage. This continues to stack and can be reprocced, so as long as you keep hitting weak spots, you're going to get 12% times 3. I was going to give you 36% ongoing weak spot damage. Mask. Now, there's a little bit of a conversation here with the light cannon. I think this is probably going to... Fortress Warfare is probably going to become the meta in Way of Winter because there are some really good cradle mods. Let me show you how this works. So... Light Cannon says no super armor inside Fortress Warfare, and then it says attack plus 15%. It's a little bit confusing because I'm getting unstuck. If you have a look at Fortress Warfare, so we're going to use the long axe to trigger Fortress Warfare, and if you have a look at Fortress Warfare, it talks about heavy armor, and when you have heavy armor, it talks about getting weapon damage plus 20%. So this mod is saying you're not going to get heavy armor, and instead you're going to get attack plus 15%, right? It's confusing because you actually, even though you don't get the armor benefits, like the defensive benefits, you actually get the weapon damage still. I don't know if this is a bug or intentional or not, but you still get, from Fortress Warfare, you still get the weapon damage plus 20%, even though it says it takes away your, is it super or heavy armor? Oopsies. Even though it says it takes away your no super armor. Okay. So you still get, attack plus 15% and you get the weapon damage of 20%. So pretty good for damage. And the way, there has been a couple patches here. The way you have to trigger it is your axe has to hit the ground now and then you'll get it and then you can start your DPS, right? So you used to be able to do an animation cancel where you could start the heavy swing, switch to your gun, and Fortress Warfare would still spawn. They've got rid of that now. You can't do the animation cancel, so you do have to use the axe. You have to go for the whole swing, but you do have enough time to actually put out damage with Fortress Warfare doing that. It mainly has changed people that were using a secondary to mark a target and then switching to their primary to do DPS, so... it's still very viable if you just do the axe swing and then switch for DPS. And the other reason it's incredibly viable is the Cradle perks. This scenario has Fortress Link, and this is Fortress Warfare range plus 50% with an additional damage boost of plus 5%. After activating Fortress Warfare for 5 seconds, Fortress Warfare will appear within 10 meters at a non-hostile target or at your location if no such targets are nearby. So what that means is you get a second Fortress Warfare for another 5 seconds, giving you a total of like 10 seconds of Fortress Warfare. If you're running solo, this is incredibly good because it's always going to respawn on you, gives you plenty of time to swing your axe, change your primary, and just do damage. And if you're in a team, if you can stick together, you're going to have a lot of uptime with Fortress Warfare. Very cool. Okay, for the gloves, my recommendation is actually run Munitions Amplifier with weapon damage plus 15% because of the way this stacks with weak spot damage. The difference between you choosing munitions and weak spot is like less than 1%. Weapon damage, though, is not going to punish you if you miss a weak spot shot. That being said, you can use Weakspot damage boost for plus 25% if you've got better secondary attributes on that. However, I would be trying to get munitions amplifier for the weapon damage. Okay, over to shoes. Covered Advance is always pretty standard in the slot, mainly because it has status damage and weapon damage, 20% for 30 seconds if you don't get hit for 4 seconds. That being said, you can use slow and steady if you have another, if you have a slow and steady with better secondary attributes. The reason for this is you get 20%, you get the same buff base, you get 20% status and you get 20% weapon damage, but only when your HP is above 90%. Thing is, you can keep your HP up pretty easily with this build if you're running Frosty Blessing, because this is restoring your HP. So some good synergy there. If you have a really well-rolled slow and steady, you can factor that in instead of covered advance. Right, for the top, you do want to go with weapon damage again. Similar reasoning for the gloves. The difference between choosing weapon damage over weak spot damage due to their damage stacking. Weapon performs very well and won't punish you if you actually miss a weak spot. Whereas if you only spec in the weak spot and you miss a weak spot, you're getting no benefits. And then finally on the bottoms, Bullet Siphon. This is going to give you more weapon damage. Definitely going to help having a larger magazine. So this is good having the 4th slot in the Renegade to give you some more bullets, because every 5 bullets you're going to get some more weapon damage capped at 20%. And for the food buffs, I use the Crumbly Bread, which gives you increase all weapon damage by 25%, and then the Whimsical Drink, which gives you a 25% status damage bonus. Okay, starting with a general overview of my crit build and beginning with the calibrations. So all my calculations used a double crit rate on the calibration. Once again, I think Precision Style is an excellent calibration because of how good the attack stat is, the attack plus 25%. But like I said before, I didn't actually do the math on these, so needed a bit more time. With the attributes, like I said previously, every mod I gave a crit damage plus 15%. So basically you've got like god rolls on everything for all your mods. For the armor set bonuses, we're going with the Lone Wolf set. So this is all pretty standard crit build stuff. I would try to get a full set of all 4 pieces so you get the max use out of that. With the unique, I'm using the same as the weak spot build. Like I also said, this build is about having a little bit of utility and also having damage. It does both things. So I personally love the Covert Walker shirts. It's also called the Stealth Walker in your blueprints, and sucks in enemies for easy damage. And like before, you can swap in this snow camo gloves if you're just looking at pure boss DPS. And then lastly, in your what I call your flexi slot, because you just have one piece of gear slot left, you can use the Bastille to get you extra 10% damage. Or if you're struggling with the heat or the cold, they're the new black, what's it called? Let me open this. Blueprints, armor. The Blackstone set gives you cold and heat resist plus 2.5 off the first perk, so you could use that as well. Okay, let's talk about the weapon mods for a crit build. Just ignore any suffixes here that are not violent. This was just the screenshots I took. Like I said, all the attributes were a violent suffix with max crit damage. Starting with the weapon mods, like I said previously, you want some utility in this build. Frosty Blessing is my favorite because it restores HP when the Frost Vortex disappears. If you really want to min-max, you can use Cryoblast and get a 4% on your vulnerability. So the difference in damage is actually 4% because vulnerability stacks with all your damage, your status damage, your elemental damage, and your weapon damage. Looking at the helmet, now you're primarily using the crit build on a single target, so a boss with no weak spot. So in that case, you're running a Fateful Strike. However, if you're like me and all your mods that you've previously grinded for are crit mods, you might not have a weak spot build ready or an elemental build ready, so you might want to use this to shoot weak spots. And if you are going to use it to shoot weak spots, use momentum up. Just be aware, when you start building towards endgame, you do want to use my weak spot build. It outperforms this, but in the meantime, you can run momentum up if you are shooting weak spots. Then moving on to the mask, targeted strike. This is all pretty standard stuff for a crit build. To proc targeted strike, you need to mark a target. My personal favorite is Bingo. You switch to bingo. The first hit of bingo will mark the target with bullseye. Bullseye is also going to get your vulnerability at 8%. If you are using this for a weak spot build and there is a weak spot you can hit, you can use the crossbow. Obviously, you see this a lot with the Treant. Treant's got a very easy to hit weak spot and people use crit on it. But like I said, with the Treant right now, if you have the mods, I would run my weak spot build over the crit. I did the calculations even using the crossbow and the weak spot build was outperforming it. Okay, with the gloves, you want crit amplifier. With the top, you want your crit damage with your blue, which is giving you crit rate and your crit damage plus 12%. With the bottoms, dead shot. And with the shoes, you have two options. Covered advance is probably the most common option here because you get weapon damage and status damage when you don't take any damage for 4 seconds. But you can run slow and steady because you do have nice amounts of health if you are running Frosty Blessing because you're getting your health back over there. And as long as you keep your health above 90, you're also going to get the 20% on status and 20% on weapon damage. And the food buffs I use, this one's really cool. It's a honey glazed meat, and it used to increase your crit rate by 15% when hitting enemies affected by Frost Vortex. So really nice. And then like last time, I also paired it with Whimsical Drink, which is going to buff your status damage by 25%. Okay, so this is the overview for the elemental build, starting with the calibrations. We have double elemental damage on our calibrations. Similar to the previous ones, we're going with the precision style for the calibration type. Our attributes are all maxed under the suffix of talents, which gives you elemental damage plus 8% on every mod. Our armor set, we've gone with the Shelterer armor set. Now there is a new armor set, I need more time to test it, that also specs into elemental damage, but just know if you run this right now with the Shelterer, if you've already had that unlocked and you do the 4 perks, it is very, very competitive, this build, and it's fun to use. Cool. Like all the previous builds, our unique is the Covert Walker shirt, and the Flexi is up to you, Bastille, or if you want to do some heat and cold resist, you can use that as well. Cool, let's move on to the mods. Okay, let's talk about the mods for an elemental build. Like I said last time, just ignore any suffixes that are not talents. All the testing was done with the talent suffix. This is just the screenshots I used. So starting with the weapon mods, you got a bunch of different options. If you want your health back, you go with the Frosty Blessing again. This is now where Vortex Multiplier is actually worth it. You have a max number of Frost Vortexes +1, and your Frost Vortex damage is plus 10%. This stacks with the crystals and the Frost Vortex. Or you can do Cryoblast for the 4% vulnerability. Technically, Cryoblast, like mathematically, should have more damage than Vortex Multiplier. However, it really depends on how often Frost Vortexes spawn and how lucky you get with the tick damage. Remember, if you spawn another Frost Vortex, it overrides the previous one once you got more than 2, and you lose out on some of that tick damage. I actually found, like, functionally, I actually got more damage with Vortex Multiplier than Cryoblast. Cool. But you've got all those options, and honestly, I prefer just getting the HP back early game. Moving on to Helmet, Deviation Expert's going to get that status damage plus 20%, but you are going to lose 25% range. You do get fire rate plus 10%. I find I'm not really prioritizing fire rate with this build, mainly because you have to get off target to shoot crystals. So you shoot the enemy, a crystal spawns, you stop shooting the enemy, you shoot the crystal, then you get back on target anyway. So I do think it's very plausible, very, very possible to go with the Elemental Havoc as the secondary option, or even your first option. As long as you have your HP above 90, you're going to get a 20% elemental damage, slightly less than 20% status damage, just because you typically will have more element stat points already in your build. But if you're running with the Frosty and you're getting your HP back, Elemental Havoc's a really good pick. Especially if you've got a well-rolled Elemental Havoc, you can pick that over Deviation Expert and not have to deal with the downsides of the range deficit there. Right, Mask. Now this is where it depends on what you're doing. If you have a single target with no weak spot, i.e. a boss with no weak spot, you're going to run Light Cannon. If you've skipped to this part of the video, the way that you're proccing Light Cannon is with the axe swing of the long axe. This will proc Fortress Warfare. You still get the 20% weapon damage from Fortress Warfare, even though you have no super armor, and you get the attack plus 15%. And there's also some good Cradle mods, which I'll go over at the end of this video as well. Fortress Warfare, I think, is going to be the theme for Way of Winter. If you are targeting small enemies, Obliteration is your next best bet, or is your best bet. And this stacks up to 60% of Frost Vortex final damage, and you get 15% per enemy. So four enemies in a Frost Vortex will get the max 60%. So this is your best for your ad clear, running through a silo, and it doesn't do too bad against bosses either. There are other Frost Vortex mods in the mask slot. I did test them, but they did not come out on top. That's a whole, probably another video explaining all those. My preference is Obliteration. Moving on to gloves, I went full send and just did the status on the gloves, and the same with the top. Also did status damage for the top as well, just because I wanted to see how competitive this would be against the other builds doing weak spot damage and crit damage. When you get to the bottoms, you have a little bit of a shake up here compared to the other builds. You can run Abnormal Increase, which gives you status damage plus 10% for 12 seconds when you reload when the magazine's empty, and it does stack up to 3 times. However, it doesn't refresh the stack, so you're not going to get 3 stacks with this. However, I just did the calculation with a 1 stack of it, and it was incredibly competitive with Bullet Siphon. I think it was slightly more damage. So if you have a well-rolled Abnormal Increase, you can run that, or you can run your Bullet Siphon too. Especially if you've got a large magazine, this is going to start performing quite well. And finally, same story for every build here. When it comes to the shoes, slow and steady if you're running your Frosty Blessing and getting your health back all the time. That's going to give you 20% on status and weapon damage. Otherwise, Covered Advance is also a great mod. If you've got a well-rolled Covered Advance, does the same thing, but you just have to not take damage for 4 seconds, and you will have that buff for 30 seconds. All right, our food buffs for the elemental build is the same as the Weakspot build, using the crumbly bread, which is giving you 25% weapon damage, and the whimsical drink giving you 25% status damage. Okay, let's go over the Cradle Override options, starting from the top: Anti-Void, Tactical Combo, Status Enhancement, which is really good for our Weakspot build, because after you hit a weak spot, you get status damage plus 25%. Sustained Suppression, Steady Hand, which is while in Fortress Warfare or Fast Gunner, weak spot damage plus 40%. You can see why our weak spot build does really well, because we're using Fortress Warfare, and we're getting that buff, and we're also getting the status enhancement buff, which is really nice. Frost Sense, this is a new one. This gives when you summon a Frost Vortex or Ice Crystal or Ice Spike, frost damage plus 3% for 8 seconds. Just know there is a kind of error at the moment. You'll see this buff pop up even if you're not at this level and have this unlocked in Way of Winter, but it doesn't apply until you equip it. So if you're wondering what the hell Frost Sense is when you're using Frost Vortex, it's this. Even if you haven't unlocked it, it will show in your buffs, but it doesn't actually apply. And then lastly, a Fortress Link. This is what makes Fortress Warfare really strong in Way of the Winter. And that is Fortress Warfare range plus 50% with additional damage boost of 5%. And then activating Fortress Warfare for 5 seconds. Fortress Warfare will appear within 10 meters at a non-hostile target location, or at your location if no such targets are nearby. So if your team's all together, you'll basically get a Fortress Warfare spawned back on top of you. Or if you're running solo, you're going to get a second Fortress Warfare, giving you a huge amount of uptime in Fortress Warfare. Really, really cool. Okay, so my overall impressions of this new weapon. I think it's a jack of all trades, but master of none. I don't think you're going to be at the top of the DPS board, and I think a lot of people focus on who does the most damage. However, it does everything kind of okay, kind of good. You can control ads with the Frost Vortex. You get some health back. You can group ads together. You shoot a crystal, you explode them, and it is very stable. You can do a weak spot build, you can do a crit build, you can do an elemental build. So it's very, very flexible. And I think that is kind of the strength of this weapon, is its flexibility. Regardless of what your previous builds are, you can probably find mods to just start using it straight away and be relatively competitive, which is super nice. I am going to compare it to all the other new weapons. So like, comment, subscribe, stick around to the channel, and we'll go over some of the other weapons too. I do want to min-max a little bit more. For this video, I just really wanted to see, like, could you make a competitive crit build? Could you make a competitive elemental build? Could you make a competitive Weakspot build? And the answer is yes, you can. It's pretty good. So yeah, enjoy. I'll start working on some new videos with the new weapons as soon as I can. If you'd like to support the channel, leave a comment and a like. All right, bye-bye. See ya.